Now, 6 months have passed since one of South Africa's darkest moments of 2021, that's the July Unrest. Some of the many media professionals who covered the unrest, including the authors of 8 Days in July, candidly share their recollections. eNCA senior reporter eNCA compiled this special report for us.
Look at this. Look at this.
The July Unrest. It's hard to believe that a time as vicious and brutal as those weeks that we saw in July could be reduced to 2 words: July Unrest. But that's what it is now when we look at it almost 6 months later. The July Unrest was a time like no other, an unprecedented time, as we kept calling it during that period. And as journalists, we experienced what many of us thought we would never experience. It felt almost like all of the violence and all of the protest and all of the murders and all of the uncertainty that we had covered throughout our careers had all been rolled into just a few days in July. I'm eNCA, and over the next few minutes, I'm going to introduce you to some of the journalists that covered the July Unrest.
My name is Jeff Wicks, and I'm an investigative journalist with News 24. In the lead up to the arrest of former President Jacob Zuma, all of our staff were deployed across the country. I was in Johannesburg, and we had colleagues at eNCA in KwaZulu-Natal.
I'm Kanyiso Mjarose. I am a camera operator at eNCA, and I started covering the unrest when it was more of just protests and like just a social media type of hype, before it became what it actually became.
My name is Lethiwe Mdluli, and I first started covering the July Unrest on 12th July.
My name is Kavil Singh. I am the senior correspondent for News 24 in KwaZulu-Natal. I would say that I was first roped into the story of the July Unrest quite early on, during the build-up to the incarceration of former President Jacob Zuma.
One of the first signs for me personally that this was unlike any other protest we'd covered came very early in July. This was around about the 4th of July and before the former president had gone to prison. It was a Sunday morning, and a number of supporters from eThekwini, ANC supporters and Zuma supporters in particular, decided to form a motorcade and drive to eNCA on that day. This was now to show support to the former president. That trip started out quite normally. High-end motor vehicles, quantums, and an assortment of cars got onto the freeway and decided to head north in the direction of eNCA. But the second that convoy stopped on a national freeway on the N2 and all of those supporters got out, that was when I knew that there was absolutely no respect for the law whatsoever. And that was only the start. It was a few minutes later that some of those in the group had taken out firearms and fired shots into the air and into the bushes, showing their dissatisfaction with what was going to happen to the former president in the next few days. They did this at random, all the way from Durban up until eNCA, stopping intermittently, blocking the road, not allowing any traffic to pass, firing shots into the air, getting out of their vehicles, dancing and singing. All of this happening on National Road. And most interestingly for me was the lack of police presence on that day and the lack of any kind of intervention by the SAPS, the RTI, or any of the authorities that you would normally expect to clamp down in a situation like that.
Within hours of his arrival at the Escort Correctional Centre, we saw instances of strategic road closures, and that happened almost simultaneously across the province. It started with major arterial routes of the N2 and the N3 and quickly spread to smaller district roads. And I think that was sort of the first augur of what was to come. This was a highly organized spate of unrest, and strategic road closures were essentially the first shot of what was to come over the next 8 days.
I think on Friday, I believe it was around the 9th of July, for me, it really began to show on the ground that things were really starting to get out of control in a very different way. We often experience protest action in our reporting in KwaZulu-Natal, but in this particular case, it was very sporadic, a lot more coordinated, and a lot more widespread throughout the city of Durban.
It was on the first Sunday where there was major unrest in the Johannesburg Central Business District and Hillbrow in particular, and we arrived in the mid-morning, and the first thing we were confronted with was a murder, and a security guard had been shot and killed, and we covered that scene before following police on what seemed like endless hours of trying to clear the city out, as they traded live gunfire in some instances with looters and rioters. And it was a day of complete bedlam in the city, which would soon spread to other parts of Gauteng.
I remember it started at around midnight on Monday, but when we came in the morning, I drove to work and it looked normal, but when we got to Montclair, it was bad. During the course of the day, it just got worse. And then I started realizing, this is not going to end. It had started on Friday at night with the trucks burning.
It is incredible what people are doing and what lengths they are going to ensure that they can get their piece of the pie. It's like, it literally is like a kind of illegal Christmas that has come here to Durban.
We saw police vans going to areas where stores were being looted. And they weren't able to do anything because of the large numbers. Many of them were not trained to deal with large crowds. They were not equipped with rubber bullets and stun grenades to disperse those crowds. And so began the story of a police force that was severely outnumbered and unprepared for what was going to happen in just over a week.
The police were actually in the middle of a shootout during that period of time with these instigators or perpetrators that were at the bottom of a hill adjacent to the freeway and just a bit of a distance away from the mall. And they had been firing live rounds at the police and had shot and injured one of the Metro Police officers in their leg. And I was suddenly in the middle of this shootout, just trying my best to sort of remain as small as possible. You could feel live rounds passing you. Police were shooting back. It was absolutely chaotic. Eventually, the Metro Police did manage to get control of that area, but it was really the first indication that things were extremely volatile to the point where you could lose your life.
I remember we went to Marian Hill this one time, and it was a warehouse. They distribute alcohol to different places around Durban, and people were wanting to invade that place. And fortunate for that warehouse, the police were there. I don't know who called them, but they managed to make their way to the warehouse and try to protect it, but they were outnumbered. So we got there as the community was trying to get in, and they were throwing stones, and they were coming, mobs and mobs of people. And the police were outnumbered. They were trying their best to protect the place, but it was just not working. And I remember I had to do a live crossing at that moment. And my colleague was just like, okay, we need to think about ourselves as well. I mean, this job is important, but we need to be safe. And there were rocks being thrown our way. Police were trying to get us out the way. I remember during a live crossing, we had to run. It was the first time I had to run live on air. And I was crossing with Braden at the time, and he was just like, okay, tell us when we can come back.
2 dead bodies have been found near where we were earlier on in Queen. is starting to be badly decomposed. I mean, this is a body that we ourselves have seen over the past 3 days or so, and there's no knowing as to why that body has not been taken away from underneath the bridge.
I got a phone call, one of many phone calls that I got, and a contact of mine had said to me, several people had been killed in Phoenix. And at first I was taken aback because I didn't hear this through any of the official sources. I hadn't heard it. And he was insistent, and he said that this was in fact the case, and it was someone that I trusted. Within a few minutes, he sent me a message saying to me that 4 people had been killed as far as he knew. And I started getting worried, and I was suspicious. What was going on in Phoenix? Why were we not hearing this from anyone else? For reference, Umhlanga to Phoenix is probably not more than 12 minutes apart. So we got back, and with very little sleep, hungry, having not had lunch, we decided that we needed to check this out for ourselves.
So we stopped, we pulled on the side of the road, and we explained we were from ETV. Then the community was actually excited. They're like, okay, cool. Can we talk to you guys? And what they really wanted to express was how unhappy they were with what was going on. And they were saying, listen, we want to get this to the public's eye. The public needs to know that people are looting and they're using Phoenix as a route. So we jump out, we set up, and then I think we were just about to roll. Our gallery could already see like the picture. And then as we were just about to go live, this man comes carrying a panga, you know. So we're like just confused, who's this now? The guy comes up to us and like, where are you guys from? And then Dessen explains that, you know, we from ETV. The guy swears at us, tells us to leave. And what I did notice that the panga had blood and the guy was almost covered in blood. So, but before we left, they wanted to speak to Dessen, and they said, okay, Dessen, you wait here, but your camera guy needs to go to the car. And I was confused, why are we being separated now? So I thought maybe they want to attack Dessen. So I was like, no, because even gallery was asking my ear, like, are you guys okay? What's going on? Like, no. And I told them, I'm not going to leave here. We came with Dessen, we're going to leave together. Then the community was like, okay, because it seemed like they were almost afraid of this guy.
It was very difficult. I think anyone that reported on it would have received some form of backlash. And really, we were just reporting facts and the truth of what was happening on the ground. The barricade that went up near the Phoenix police station is still one of the most heinous accounts of violence were really reported in this area, and it was something that had to be told. So difficult, most certainly, but I think we were all duty bound to take the heat that was coming and really report on the truth.
Then there was 2 guys on the road, like on the floor, and one of them wasn't moving, and the second guy was still moving, but just like a little bit.
And Mkanyuso made a comment to me on that day, and he says, you know, the men on the floor don't look like looters, and the car that they're driving just doesn't fit. So why would they be beat up? Why would they be killed?
That shocked us, you know. We were like, goodness, what are we witnessing? What is going on?
As well, what's behind me now is, as I mentioned, that cordoned off area. Police are on scene. The number at this point is not confirmed. We still need to get those details. As you would have heard from this officer, the liaison officer is on their way. So they're not giving us those details. But we understand that between 4 and 7 people may have been killed here. I don't want to call them suspects because we don't know if that's in fact what they are.
Days later, we were supposed to go do a story in Guamash. And we ended up not going to do that story. And, you know, I thank God that we didn't go cover that story with Dessen, because that, like when they came back to the office with the crew that went there and I was seeing the visuals, I realized that those guys from Guamashu were the two guys that we saw on the side of the road. We actually witnessed these guys dying, but at the time we did not know what was going on. And I think that, for me, that's when I realized like something was terribly, terribly wrong. Something had gone wrong, and it was an experience I don't think I want to ever experience again. Like, yeah.
On that first day, as we were covering protest action in Hillbrow, the atmosphere of the unrest seemed different. There were sporadic outbreaks and the looters were relentless. It was a complete departure from law and order. Journalists were coming under attack, people were jeering at us, people were jeering at the police, and it was a complete decline. The city had sort of descended into this lawless wasteland, and it was hours before control was regained and the city was taken back from the looters. And I think what stood apart for me was the fact that, you know, on that day, as we saw police constantly fending off looters and unrest would spark in a different area, it seemed intentional and it seemed distinct from what I've ever felt before covering protest action.
It was just a mess. The following day, I received a call from a woman who was very frantic. She was worried, and she says she hasn't seen her brother since last night. And I asked her, when was the last time, like, you guys had any sort of communication? And she's like, I haven't had communication with him since last night. And then I remember, and then I asked her, when was the last place, where was he? And she says, I think he was at the warehouse where there was looting last night. I saw you reporting from there. And then I remember there was a stampede. And then, like, a few hours later, I called her and she said they'd found the body in one of the warehouses there. I think I would never forget that.
There were incidents that just that I look back to, and they just make me think, like, I'll never forget that we'd gone back to that, you know, like things that we were told about growing up, and suddenly now I had to, you know, in 2021 think, okay, we're going to go cover a certain place, the story during that time, that period of the unrest, and we had to consider that, you know, that there'd be times where I'd be like, okay, at Destin we're going to this community, you know, and we have to worry about each other, and I'd be like, okay, Destin, I'm worried about you, or Destin will be worried about me. That I'll never forget.
While the rest of us covered the violence that ensued the entire afternoon, running battles between looters and criminals and the police, through this entire sort of chaos that was ensuing, with the premier shouting at everyone, there were two young boys that we had become aware of who had passed on from the night before. They had been a massive stampede on the Nandi Drive Bridge, and these two boys, who could have been older than 12, jumped over the overpass bridge, and unfortunately to their death. There were very few resources, policing resources, available in the area, despite the provincial executive being there, and their bodies weren't even covered the entire afternoon. So while the Premier's barking orders and, you know, getting great camera shots, below us, the bodies and the loss of humanity, really, for our city and our country really came out in that moment.
In complete darkness, we realized that the looters were opening fire on security forces that were there. So this was security officials, police, and just the community in general. From the darkness, they were guarding everything that they had looted. They were watching the stock that they had taken out of these warehouses and waiting to distribute. So what do? They formed a guard around all of these items and opened fire at anyone and anything that tried to get closer. And we were there. we were right next to these security officials who at some point realized that it was pointless. What were they going to do? They couldn't see the enemy. The enemy was invisible. All they got and all we got was just the whizzing of bullets that went past us.
We were in the midst of a shootout the other night when security officials were on the one side and those that were guarding these stolen goods were on the opposite end.
Not only was I working in the field, very long hours, 12, 14, 16 hours a day, but you would come home and I'd have to be concerned about my safety at home, my partner's safety. We had a lot of issues with food supply. We couldn't get any food at all.
To be honest, when it comes to emotions, I wasn't even thinking about my emotions at that point. I was literally thinking about, I need to get to the next story. I need to report on what's happening there, and then I'll get a call from somewhere else, and then I'll go there. So emotionally, I didn't take it in. I was more focused on just reporting and on everything that's happening. So it really hit me when I was done, like when we knew that it was done. There were threats still, but I was able to drive home for the first time. And then I got home and I started watching the news, because when you're working, you don't have the time to sit down and watch what you're working on and see what others are doing and stuff like that. So it really hit me when I got home, and then I opened the TV and then I watched the news, and for the first time I really saw the destruction.
Like emotionally, I'd never thought that I'd find myself crying behind the lens. And there was a time where we did like an interview that literally made me cry behind the lens, and I never thought I'd ever feel that, like where emotions, generally we experience a lot of things, we see a lot of things, and we just learn to stomach a lot. So the experience actually broke me in such a way that while I was shooting, I actually felt tears, because I was wondering, why are my eyes hot? Like why? And then I realized I was tearing up.
We were experiencing, like everyone else in KZN, a set of circumstances that we couldn't separate ourselves from. We couldn't isolate ourselves from that, because we were worried about the fuel in our cars. We were worried about not having bread at home. We were worried about the safety of our families. We were worried about the same things that you were worried about at that time.
I remember like an incident where Jason was just like joking on social media, and he was just saying like, I can't remember the last time I tasted bread, and like someone messaged us and was like, hey, I didn't say anything. It was just almost like, hey, listen, let's meet up somewhere. It sounded like it was, we give us contacts and what have you, because most of the stuff we were getting through contacts and and sources. And then when we got there, like he opened his boot and he was like, hey, you spoke about it, you haven't tasted bread in so long, and they had like just a bit of groceries for us, like bread and milk, because it felt like, we'd never taste bread ever again.
If this was a normal day before these protests, you'll see that this vehicle is now being stopped. Okay, this vehicle is actually being beaten up. There's some gunfire that's being fired there. This vehicle just actually get away.
We also had to deal with social media. The false information that was circulated there, the lies that were being peddled, the agendas that people were putting across. Many of it lies. Videos that were altered to make us look bad.
I learned actually from my colleague Deson. I actually learned through his experience, that, sometimes you need to be resilient and stand for what you believe is right. Like what he went through at the time, I personally feel like I don't know how I would have handled that. You know, like to be almost hated by two communities while you are trying to work and tell the truth. But like every time I'd speak to him and be like, you know what, I think maybe take leave, like, you know, like just take time off. That almost like killed him. He was like, no, I'm doing my job. This is my passion, and at the end of the day, the truth is the truth, and I stand for the truth. And for me, that just opened my eyes to like, you know, sometimes in life you need to actually like fight for what you believe in. You know, like at that time, most people I think would have been broken, you know. But he still went back, you know. He still went back to Phoenix. He still went back to Gomash, Umlazi, you know, despite the threats and all the stuff that he went through on social media. So I learned through him and his experience that always stand for the truth.
But more than that, I also learned that you can't separate the two. You can't separate Desmond the journalist from Desmond the South African. There are some things that happen that will affect you as a person and affect your families and affect your loved ones. The only difference is that you need to be able to, through all of that, still talk to the audience, talk to you coherently, to understand that I still have a responsibility to you to tell you a story, to report the news, to keep you informed about what's happening.
I think it's difficult to identify one root cause of the unrest, but something that is incontrovertible is the fact that it was set in motion by the arrest of former President Zuma. Actors within the ANC, and that's undeniable, then set in motion plans to destabilize the province and the country, and we saw that take dramatic effect. This was certainly not, in my opinion, a popular uprising by the poor. I think that the poor people of South Africa, who have to live in the grips of poverty every day, were whipped up and weaponized and set on a path to destruction.